I'm Dr. Christy Preddy-Franzak, and at Inclusive Schooling, we do all things inclusion, including helping folks understand what special education is and is not. So stay with me because you might be thinking, of course we know what special education is, but I think you might be surprised by this little short video on what it is and what it is not. So let's dive in. So let's start with something that we generally say or know special education is, and then I'm going to show sort of the opposite, which is our current practice, and show how we might be thinking we're doing special education, but we're in fact leading to more exclusion. Okay, so number one, special education is access to general education content, curriculum, and peers. That's a mouthful. Sometimes we say that it's really about access to, participation in, and progress towards. But then the question becomes access to what? Participation in what? And progress towards what? So this word, general curriculum, is ill-defined in federal law in the United States. It's sort of one of those things that the government said, we think you can figure it out. But through case law, through due process, and even as you read through IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act at the time of this recording, 2004, what you find is there's certain things that the general curriculum is and is not. So even though we're talking about what is special education, we have to first sort of step back and say, what is the general curriculum? Because special education is all about access to general ed. So general ed can be anything that the school has adopted, created, or provides for any student in the district. So this could be curricular or non-curricular. Some people call it the intended curriculum and the unintended curriculum as well. So anything that a student without a disability label under federal law that they have access to, can participate in, or make progress towards, that is the general curriculum. Now, we often think of a gen ed classroom, and that's certainly one aspect, but the federal law is really clear that the general ed curriculum is not a place. So we'll remember that. It's not a place, because that's going to be important when we get further down in what is special education. So if the general ed curriculum is anything that a student without a disability has access to, can participate in, and make progress towards, then what would we start to include as special education? Things that provide access to that general ed curriculum, or we might say the general education content, the general education curriculum, and general education peers. Well, things like supplementary aids, supports, and services. So anything that we do that is to supplement the gen ed, anything that we do that provides aid or support, or anything that we call a special education service. Seems like we're going in circles here. We can also think of special education as specially designed instruction, another word that needs unpacked. But for today, let's just leave it at, it doesn't have to be special or expensive, or it doesn't have to be delivered by a special educator, right? There's a lot of special going on. It just means designed for me, the student with the disability, because you're thinking about my needs to have access to, participate in, and make progress towards. It could also be a phrase that we hear all the time, which would be accommodations and modifications. That can be special education. It can be related service providers, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, mental health, behavioral supports. All of that can fall under special education. You're like, of course, that's what we do. However, special education is not a place. Remember, I said, put a pin in it. It is not a place, it is not a person, and it is not a program. So even though we talked about that we're going to provide supplementary aid services and supports, specially designed instruction, related services, accommodations, it doesn't make it special ed when we create a resource room or a self-contained classroom or a building or a school outside of the district. That actually moves us away from this ability for the student with the disability to have access to the general education content, curriculum, and peers of all other students that go to that school. Okay. So it's also not a person. Special education doesn't need to be delivered by a special education teacher or educator, a paraprofessional, a related service provider. Now, there are services that those folks have expertise with and will need to be able to consult with or in times do direct service. However, special education is not defined as special education because of the person who is delivering it. It's also not a program. So you might have a life skills program or an applied behavior analysis program for students with autism. Anything that we've sort of pulled over or pulled aside or pulled out in a way for a particular label or in a particular place delivered by a particular person doesn't make it special education. Even something like social emotional support in the social emotional classroom by the special ed teacher, that does not make it special ed, and it certainly doesn't make it inclusive. So what is special ed again? Let's think about that side. It's responsive, it's customized, it's individualized, but it's also embedded. It's within the context of the general education content, curriculum, and peers. It's also a right of students in the United States. So it's a right of students in the United States that have been identified as a student with a disability that have special education. But it doesn't mean that we are asking to pull out, pull over, pull aside, or make a special place or special program by special people. Okay. And it certainly is not encouraging us to make a separate space. So separate curriculum, a separate set of standards, a separate place or way of learning. Any kind of support, accommodations, modifications, or specially designed instruction that a student needs would be embedded into the general education content, curriculum, and peers. Lastly, special education is access. So it's all about removing barriers. If you remember nothing else, it's this idea that your job, whatever your role is, wherever you're working within a school system, from administration to bus drivers, because you're all part of that system, it's to remove barriers for students. Now, we would love to say that our job is to remove barriers for all students, but specifically under federal law in the United States, for a student with a disability, that is our main job. It's why we have special education. It's why we have IEPs. It's why we have an IEP team. This whole idea of removing barriers to access. Well, access to what? Access to the general education curriculum, content, and peers, progress towards, and participation in. So it means that we're not going to be doing ability grouping. We're not going to be cohorting students, and we're certainly not going to be providing those services in separate spaces and places. So to achieve inclusion, if you've been kind of struggling, it might take some time, but sit down and think about which of the ways that you're providing special education services currently fit what we mean by special education and what we don't mean by special education.